there are 30% fewer birds in North America than there were just a few decades ago. Qualitatively, we know that we are killing birds. Power line collisions are one way. Window collisions are another way.
Collision issues are very challenging, and unfortunately, because these interactions are really pretty poorly studied from a scientific standpoint, it's really difficult to know exactly what to do. I know the issue is much greater than many people suspect. Animals interacting with wires goes back as to when wires were first strung across this country. The first indication of bird collisions that made it in the scientific literature was by a man by the name of Coues, who was a naturalist. And he was riding a horse from Denver up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so he was following a telegraph wire so he wouldn't get lost. Ahead of him, he could see these large flocks of birds that were getting flushed as he would get close to them, and they were passing through the telegraph wire. And when he got to those locations, he noticed, injured and dead birds. He said, "I don't know what we could ever do to solve this. Ultimately, I think we're going to have to live with fewer birds."
In simplest terms, birds collide with power lines because they don't see them. So most collisions happen at night, when power lines are difficult to detect.
In part, it might be the birds that fly quickly or fly in flocks where they don't have a great view ahead of them. It could be the birds that are not real nimble flyers. They might be strong, they might have a lot of endurance, but they're not able to maneuver around obstacles very quickly. There are also certain areas where they might happen. So we think about water crossings where power lines cross water bodies, rivers or inlets as spots that we would keep an eye on.
And because collisions with power lines typically don't create any kind of an outage, they're just usually not investigated, and birds are quickly scavenged once they hit the ground.
It might fall into a river or a body of water below the span, and it might be swept away, which makes it really hard to get our handle on the issues.
A large part of our understanding of avian collision is that it affects mostly birds like ducks, geese, and swans, large water birds. But in fact, that may be in large part a consequence of detectability. So if you imagine yourself driving down a highway at 70 miles an hour and there's a power line along the road, if there are, say, 10 or 12 swans dead under that power line, it's fairly easy to notice those large white birds. But when we walk power lines and we look carefully along the length of the line, we also tend to find other carcasses. So we know that many species are affected.
The best practice for preventing collisions, I'd say, would first be starting with the routing of a line to begin with. Then you need to look at the configuration that you're going to be using, minimize the number of wire levels that a bird would have to cross over, mark those that the birds would have to go over, particularly static wires, monitor to make sure that what you're doing is working. And you would also have to have an understanding of when are the collisions occurring. I mean, if the birds are colliding at night, then you need to make sure you've got some kind of a marking system where birds can be attuned to that.
One of the most influential projects that we've done at EDM was the development of the Avian Collision Avoidance System, which is a UV, ultraviolet light-based system for illuminating power lines And the concept there is that birds, at least some birds, can see ultraviolet light, and most people cannot. So if we can shine ultraviolet light on power line spans where we know collisions are occurring, we can hopefully light up those power lines from a bird's perspective, but not make them any more noticeable to people. So far, we've conducted 3 successful experiments with the avian collision avoidance system. When we did our own research, we showed a collision reduction of 98%, and when the Audubon Society and the Crane Trust followed up and did their own research, they also found a collision reduction of over 90%. One of the coolest things we've been doing lately is using drones to install line markers on power lines to make those power lines more visible to birds. Line markers have long been installed on power lines, but a primary hindrance to that is that when the power line crosses open water, the technique to install them has required a person hanging out the side of a helicopter to install the line markers by hand. Using drones instead of helicopters can reduce costs, reduce human risks, and increase the use of line markers overall, and then reduce collisions more than we have been doing in the past.
The last piece of it is to make sure that when these lines go in, that there's some science that's collected. So what's working? For instance, we did a project on the East Coast, and we knew that lots of raptors were using the mountains in the area to move back and forth during migration. And we had a new transmission line that was going to bisect that area. And so we were asked to come in and to basically make recommendations for marking and then do monitoring. And one of the things that we did is that we went beyond monitoring to actually use rangefinders to collect data on exactly where the birds were in 3D space before the line was put in and then after the line was put in. And what we found is that these diurnal raptors actually adjusted, their flight heights to go over the transmission line. We were able to show that from a statistical standpoint. And that's the kind of study that's not rocket science, but there's nothing like it in the literature. And I feel like we should be doing more things like that, even though it may be very simple, very basic. And likewise, there will be failures. And I think that's the other piece, is that we also need to publish failures when things don't work, because oftentimes we learn more from the things that don't work. There's a lot of work there that still needs to be done.